Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the monumental miscalculations, the wild strategic blunders, and those massive turning points that completely collapsed Nazi Germany. We're going to map out exactly how an unstoppable military machine was ultimately brought to its knees. To really grasp the scale of this collapse, we've got to look at where things stood back in July 1940. Hitler had essentially swept the board. You've got Austria, Poland, Norway, Belgium, Denmark, France, literally all invaded and occupied. Down south, his ally Mussolini completely controlled Italy. And because of a non-aggression pact securing his eastern border with the Soviets, there was really only one major European nation left standing in his way: Britain. So you have to ask, how exactly did this massive, seemingly invincible empire just fall apart? All right, so we're tracking this domino effect of hubris across 5 key phases today. 1. Britain stands alone. 2. The Soviet miscalculation. 3. Global powers enter. 4. The final squeeze. And 5. Redrawing the map. Let's get right into it. Section 1. Britain stands alone. So, picture this. It's the summer of 1940. Across the Atlantic, America wants absolutely nothing to do with the war yet, meaning the UK is the absolute last European holdout. Now, Hitler, he genuinely expected that with mainland Europe conquered, Britain would just fold and sign a peace treaty. He figured there was no way they'd risk their entire country against his overwhelming forces. But Winston Churchill had other plans. He delivered that iconic, fiery speech that completely shattered Hitler's expectations, making it abundantly clear there would be zero surrender. And man, did that frustrate Hitler. In response, he started drawing up Operation Sea Lion, a full-scale invasion of the UK. But here's the catch. There's no land connection, and the British Royal Navy absolutely dominated the water. So Hitler had to take to the skies. Starting in July 1940, his overwhelming German Luftwaffe launched this massive, relentless bombing campaign. And the numerical contrast here is just staggering. You've got 2,600 German aircraft staring down a mere 700 from the British Royal Air Force. Despite those terrifying odds, the British actually held their ground. On September 15th, Hitler went all in, sending over 1,000 fighter jets and bombers to just wipe London off the map. Yet, somehow, that smaller British Royal Air Force successfully intercepted and crushed those waves of attacks. They downed over 60 German aircraft and only lost 29. Now, why did that happen? Well, it boils down to this. An invader is fighting for territory, sure. But a defender? They are fighting for literal existence. This Battle of Britain Day handed Hitler his very first major defeat, proving that an unbreakable motivation to survive can absolutely trump sheer technological numbers. Which brings us to Section 2. The Soviet miscalculation. Once he realized Britain wasn't going to just easily topple over, Hitler had to shelve Operation Sea Lion and pivot east. And, this brings us to his second, and honestly probably his most fatal blunder. Remember that non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union we mentioned? Well, scratch that. Hitler's extreme megalomania and his deep-seated hatred for communists completely overrode any strategic sense. He delusionally believed he was basically the ruler of the world, and that capturing a massive territory like the Soviet Union was the absolutely necessary step to cement Germany as the undisputed #1 global superpower. It was just pure, unadulterated hubris. So, on June 22nd, 1941, he launches this huge surprise invasion. He rolled out his famous blitzkrieg, or lightning war tactic, dividing his massive forces into 3 very distinct groups. He sent one sweeping north towards Leningrad, where Stalin lived, one charging straight through the center toward Moscow, and the third pushing south down through Ukraine. This was an absolutely colossal clash. The Soviets had this huge numerical advantage. We're talking 20,000 tanks compared to Germany's 6,000. But the German tech was incredibly advanced at the time. Hitler's forces actually pushed 100 kilometers in just 2 days. They eventually stalled out just 300 kilometers outside of Moscow. But then, internal command disagreements really delayed their push until October. And that's when the brutal Russian winter hit. The freezing cold heavily favored the Soviet troops, who were totally used to it, and it brought that terrifying German war machine to an absolute freezing halt. Moving on to Section 3, Global Powers Enter. So, as the Eastern Front literally freezes into this grueling, deadly stalemate, sudden shifts on the global stage start expanding the conflict in a dramatic way. What's crucial to grasp here is just how fast the tide turned at the very end of 1941. In December, Japan launches an unprovoked attack on America's Pearl Harbor, tragically killing over 2,300 troops. And instantly, the previously isolationist United States gets dragged right into the war alongside the Allied forces. This was closely followed by some devastating blows to the Axis powers. America took out vital Japanese carriers at the Battle of Midway in 42, and then by February 1943, following the deadliest single battle of the entire war, nearly 300,000 starving, freezing German soldiers surrendered to the Soviets at Stalingrad. And those dominoes? They were falling elsewhere too. Down in Italy, the civilian population had absolutely had enough. This anti-fascist movement swelled, heavily led by partisans. These were just everyday civilians who literally took up arms for their freedom. In July 1943, they revolted, executed dictator Mussolini, and formed a brand new government that completely abandoned Hitler. As a quick, fascinating side note, that exact uprising is what birthed the famous resistance song Bella Ciao, which literally calls out to the partigiano, or partisan.
All right, Section 4, the final squeeze.
With Italy flipping sides, the Soviets aggressively pushing in from the east, and America now fully mobilized, the Allies geared up to finally crush Hitler's forces. 150,000? Think about that number for a second. It is monumental. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, over 150,000 British, American, and Canadian soldiers pulled off this terrifying, historic amphibious landing right on the beaches of Normandy, France. And this actually marked the very first time British ground troops had fought the German army in France since the evacuations at Dunkirk years prior. At this point, Hitler was utterly, completely trapped. To even try and deal with the Western invasion, he had to withdraw troops from the Soviet front. But the second he did that, the Soviets launched a massive counterattack, snapping up 600 kilometers of territory in just 2 months. Germany was being violently squeezed from the west, the south, and the east. Out of pure desperation, Hitler launched his final major offensive in the Ardennes forest, which you probably know is the Battle of the Bulge. But it just wasn't enough. The Allied forces countered hard, with devastating, city-crumbling aerial bombings on places like Dresden. By the time the Allied leaders sat down at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the writing was pretty much on the wall. They announced that any country declaring war on Germany could actually join the Allies. And suddenly, nations from all across the globe, we're talking Venezuela, Uruguay, Egypt, Turkey, they all officially piled on, completely and totally isolating Hitler's crumbling empire on the world stage. But as the Allies pushed deep into German territory during those really painful final months, a time when roughly 30,000 people were dying every single day, they uncovered a truly horrifying reality. Advancing troops discovered Hitler's concentration camps. This revealed to the entire world the cruel, systemic murder of hundreds of thousands of innocent Jews. It was a dark, incredibly solemn confirmation of the absolute evil they had been fighting against all along. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Redrawing the Map. The walls finally totally closed in on Berlin in May 1945. Surrounded by the Soviet army, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. Just over a week later, on May 8th, Germany formally surrendered. And the consequences? They were immediate and literally world-altering. German territories were split right down the middle, creating East and West Germany. Poland was actually recreated using a massive chunk of former German land. The map of Europe as we know it today was literally carved straight out of the ashes of this surrender. And get this, to make absolutely sure that historic enemies like France and Germany would never ever tear the continent apart again, they deployed this fascinating economic strategy. They formed the European Coal and Steel Committee to essentially intertwine their economies. Over the decades, this trade agreement expanded to include neighboring nations like Italy and Britain. It evolved step by step until the year 2000, when it officially became the European Union, erasing physical borders to basically mandate peace through shared prosperity.
Now, on a global scale, the victorious Allied power stepped up to take on the massive responsibility of maintaining world peace. They became the permanent members of the newly established United Nations in October 1945. And to stabilize the fractured global economy and provide serious military deterrence, they built massive institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and NATO. The entire architecture of our modern geopolitical world was designed right here, as a direct response to Hitler's ambitions. Now, while it did take 2 more months and the truly devastating atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for Japan to finally surrender and officially end the fighting, World War II left us with these robust frameworks for peace. And honestly, these institutions have successfully prevented a conflict of that scale for nearly 80 years. But it leaves us with a critical, lingering question. As borders are being challenged once again, and the geopolitical map shifts in our modern world, are the safeguards built back in 1945 still strong enough to hold today?